of the failure of leadership behind the door.
He had no idea what he was doing.
If this is the standard of our leaders today, we're in trouble.
So, what kind of leader are you aiming to be?
Holy mackerel, how'd you do that?
Good leaders remember they are people first.
Leadership is hard.
Let me name those three things in a succinct way now.
We're taking leadership to a better place. Thank you for being with us on the Leadership Listening podcast.
Increasingly, charity leaders particularly are under a really high degree of scrutiny. I think the media's attitude towards charities has changed quite a lot, and we often now see quite negative headlines and quite a lot of attacks on charities. And partly it's because the relationship that the public and charities have is really important, and people care deeply about the work of many charities.
So today is a very happy day for me because I'm going to cast my mind back 25 years when I was chairman of the Suzy Lamplugh Trust, and we needed our first chief executive. And I've taken myself back to the paperwork that existed at the time, and it said we were looking for a charismatic individual with drive, initiative, and sensitivity to take over the leadership from the founders who had lost their daughter, body never found, and the founders were Paul and Diana Lamplugh. Having looked at the paperwork, I then found that we had over 150 applicants, one of whom was Julie Bentley, who is here with Leadership Listening this morning. We made a great appointment on that day, and Julie was very happily with us for 4 years. But the trajectory was always, I think, going to be onwards and upwards. So in due course, Julie became Chief Executive of the Family Planning Association, Vice Chair of Shelter UK, Chief Executive of Girl Guiding, Chief Executive of Action for Children, and since 2020, Julie has been the Chief Executive of Samaritans. So, as you might imagine, all of that has left me a bit breathless. I think it would leave anybody breathless, to be honest. So, Julie, you're very welcome to the Leadership Listening podcast this morning. Tell us a little bit, first of all, so that we get into the conversation, and you and I know each other extraordinarily well anyway. Your early life, family, education, what happened in that era?
I'm 57 now, and I was born into a very, very working class family in Essex, and what would now be described as very low socioeconomic family background, as in we were pretty poor, and we were pretty uneducated, and my parents were manual labourers. My mum was a cleaner, and my dad was a manual labourer on a building site. My dad died when I was 18, but for much of my childhood I'd been brought up just by my mum anyway, because my parents were divorced and then remarried, which is another long story that we don't have time for today. And so I grew up as a very shy, very anxious, nervous child. Didn't really like to leave my mum very much, and wasn't very academically successful at school. I don't quite know what happened, but I stayed on into the sixth form, and I began there to find who Julie the adult was going to be. And by some strange quirk of events, I found myself as head girl when I was in the sixth form at school. And in that role, you do a huge amount of work for charity. It's one of the big parts of the role. And I feel like that was when I really found my calling, really, because I absolutely loved doing the work for charities. And I think that's what set me on the path to wanting to dedicate my career to the charity sector, which is what I did go on to do. After a 5-year stint as a postie, delivering letters around my hometown, and a very short spell as a police photographic technician, which I only lasted 3 months in because, frankly, I couldn't cope with the awful images that you had to see then. I was just 18 at the time. But I found my place in the charity sector, And that's where I have been ever since, where I decided to dedicate my career to. And thanks to lots of fantastic mentors along the way, one of whom I would say is you, Lawrie, I've been extraordinarily privileged to have been able to work in and with and lead some most amazing charities.
Well, that's marvelous, marvelous intro. You've led several important charities, and in that kind of leadership role, what are the sort of changes that have had to take place for the different charities, and what bits have actually remained consistent throughout that retinue of marvelous charities?
I think in terms of the things that has changed, partly what needs to change is dependent upon the actual organisation, so the size of the organisation, the scale of the organisation. So I've led very, very small organisations with 20, 30 staff, and then huge organisations with thousands and thousands of staff. And then of course I've had the privilege of leading Girl Guiding and Samaritans, where the largest part of the workforce, to use that phrase, is volunteers. At Girl Guiding, 109,000 volunteers delivered the Girl Guiding service. I think so. What's changed, I think, in those different organisations is obviously how you communicate and engage and connect. It does depend on the size, the proximity of people. It is different if you're working with a largely volunteer base or with a largely staff base. I think what's also really changed in more recent years is what people want from organisations, whether it be as a volunteer or as a staff member. Attitudes to the workplace have really changed, particularly since COVID. The next generation of workers, and indeed not just the next generation, but those in my generation, I think have really rethought what is work. And there's now much more of a keenness for a better work-life balance, which I think is a good thing in terms of people's well-being and mental health. People need and want much more flexibility in their roles, whether it be paid or voluntary roles. People's lives are more complicated. And I also think that, the current environment, both across the UK and globally, which is really impacting people's well-being and mental health, also impacts how they show up at work and the sense of support that they need as well. And I think all of that is quite new, I would say, in the last 10 to 15 years, and particularly since COVID as well. I think what hasn't changed about my leadership style within that is that I basically am. Well, I was going to say I always try and be myself, but it's not even that I try and be myself. It's just that I don't know how to be anything else. So I very much try to be honest and genuine in my communications as CEO. I try and continue to try to build teams that collaborate. And where there's a team approach over individual kind of dominance of any one member of a team. I think being available and being clear have always been important to me, and that is unchanged. That sense that just because I hold the title of Chief Executive doesn't mean that I can't be approached. And so trying to be accessible and a kind of, I always say that, what I hope is that folk in my organisations that I work with and lead, that when they think about me, they don't think chief exec, they think Julie, that they know the person that's kind of behind the title, if that makes sense. And I think the other thing that is unchanged across the many years of leadership is that I try to do what I believe is right for our service users, even when I know that that's going to be hard and unpopular. And I think that has been a consistent, and trying to be authentic about that, but also not doing things alone. I think the days of, the heroic leader who's out at the front leading the charge are long, long gone. And I think that I take a very collaborative approach. In my leadership team, there are times when, if we aren't reaching consensus, that I have to say, okay, I need to make a decision here. But my first port of call would always be, okay, let's have the debate in this room, let's hear the different perspectives, and then let's agree together what are we going to take forward. And that continues to be important to me as well. So I'd say that's a few of the kind of similarities and differences, if you like.
And some of the journey has taken you to, the national media, half-page spreads in national newspapers that I can remember. I also remember you were on Desert Island Discs. Now, that takes leadership into a different dimension. You become a public figure. How did that strike you, and how did you cope?
I think that increasingly charity leaders particularly are under a really high degree of scrutiny. I think the media's attitude towards charities has changed quite a lot. And we often now see quite negative headlines and quite a lot of attacks on charities. And partly it's because the relationship that the public and charities have is really important, and people care deeply about the work of many charities and have a real passion for the charitable cause. And therefore, that means they have a very real interest in what's happening within that charity. And that's not a bad thing. Yeah, it's right that we want the public to understand what we're doing and to be interested in us. But of course, particularly since the onset of the online world and social media, that has particularly changed, because now it isn't just, a classic traditional newspaper that you open with something, but it's basically relentlessly online 24/7. So, being trolled online is something that I have experienced. Often, folk who you've never met, mostly folk who you've never met, who think that they know you or just have decided that they don't like you for some reason. And that can be really very, very hard. It can be very hard, particularly when people are saying things about you that are simply not true, and very hard when people are questioning a moral compass that you have and that you hold very dearly. I think what I've tried to do is so I have to accept that in the roles that I'm in, that has brought me into the public domain. That's a choice I made. But I have tried very hard to protect my family and those close around me. So I very much limit anything I say about my very personal life, my partner and my family, in social media spaces, because I don't want them to find themselves exposed. They didn't choose that. But the other really important thing is, when you're being criticised very publicly, you have to know, you have to almost you have to recognise it, but not let it eat away at you. Keep it in context, because you still need to make the difficult decisions that are the right ones for your service users, knowing often that they are also ones that will attract really negative reactions. So you definitely need resilience, I think, to hold some of the leadership roles in the charity sector. And I would say often the attacks can be worse as a woman, because misogyny continues to be rife, and women often get much more of attacks than men, although not exclusively. So I think it has been difficult. It continues to be difficult. I'd be lying if I said it doesn't affect me, because it does. But very often I also just ignore it now, because you could go down a really big wormhole if you paid attention to everything negative that is said about you in public spaces sometimes. What's important is to know who to listen to and where to listen to them as well, because hearing feedback is important. That's a separate thing from when newspaper headlines, newspaper just want to sell headlines, and indeed when members of the public just want to become keyboard warriors.
Yeah, and I've always said, having fallen foul of the press once or twice, maybe a few more times, that their job is looking for headlines. And in many senses, one of the things you've got to do is watch out for that and not be too susceptible to that, which, leads you into, as you call it, a wormhole that is negative from your point of view or my point of view when that happens. If we look at leadership generally, then, and the responsibility that goes with it, what are the most difficult bits? What actually feels heaviest about it in today's environment? Social media, everybody's got an opinion. The media more generally. Sometimes I think the sort of unfairness of it in leadership roles that are just very, very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things I would say that are heavy in leadership. But for me, I think the responsibilities that feel heaviest are about the people. So I feel a huge sense of responsibility in Samaritans to the people that use our service, our callers, our service users. And so it feels heavy thinking about how do I make sure that we do continue to deliver that service, that Samaritans is here for the people who need it when they need it. And then I think the other thing that I've always found heaviest actually throughout my career is our people, our staff and our volunteers. And some of the things I've always found most difficult has been when you've had to make decisions around, for example, restructuring or making redundancies. I have never stopped finding that extraordinarily difficult. The very difficult conversations around pay and rewards and what you can afford to pay for pay rises, etc. I've had to make some really difficult decisions about that in recent years because resources are so limited. But I'm always so aware that it is people's livelihoods we're talking about, and particularly in recent years how very difficult it is out there for people. And so I think that has always been another thing that has felt really heaviest to me, thinking about being the employer of people, and how you juggle holding things so that you're doing your best for your service users, but you're also doing the best that you can through the lens of being an employer. And then, of course, giving the best experience to volunteers and making sure they have the environment and support that they need. So the things that, I think the media stuff and negative stuff in the media, that's all unpleasant, but that isn't the things that I've found heaviest. The things I've found heaviest have been about the people in my organisation and the users of my organisation services.
How does the connection work with the volunteers? So you've had them in various different charities, most notable, arguably, I think, Samaritans. The CEO with a Samaritan, somebody who is part of the 24/7, 365 operation, dealing with stuff arguably at the worst time in the middle of the night when to lots of people things seem especially dark. How does the CEO kind of connect with all of that? Did you have to train to become a volunteer or what?
I think it can be really difficult as a chief exec to connect with a huge volunteer base of people. So, as I said, at Girl Guardian, there was 109,000 volunteers. At Samaritans, we have 23,000 volunteers. And so in terms of the issues that our volunteers at Samaritans deal with, our listening volunteers, who are the folk who are at the end of the 24/7, 365 crisis support service, go through a very high degree of selection and training, as you would expect, to be able to take those really important calls. When I first joined the organisation, I was clear that I wasn't going to begin listening myself because I just felt that was too much for me to try and do as well as be the CEO. But I did want to do the training because I did want to experience and understand what is that journey of, coming into the organisation and becoming trained and qualified and then going onto the phones. and the web chat, etc. So I did go through the training program under incognito, because we decided that it wouldn't be very fair on the other folk on my training cohort if they knew they'd got the new chief exec with them. So I trained with my local branch, which is how the training happens across Samaritans, and it was an extraordinary experience, I have to say. An excellent training, delivered by volunteers at the branch, and yeah, I learned a lot actually about listening. I think the thing about it is very different. An organisation that is predominantly delivered by volunteers, because the motivations are very different often, although not exclusively, I would say. So if you have a paid workforce and a volunteer workforce, the way that those folk, need to be recognised and motivated is quite different. Volunteers are there on their own time without being financially rewarded or recognised for what they contribute. And I think something that most people across the UK don't recognise enough is so many of the services that they call upon in their day-to-day life are delivered by people who are there because they choose to volunteer their time. They're not there because they're paid. And at Samaritans, we know that that's one of the things that our service users really, really value about the service, that it isn't somebody who's there because they're paid to be. That when they reach out to us in their darkest times, they know it's somebody who's there because they wanted to be there and they chose to be there to listen. And that's a really, really powerful thing. And the motivation of why people want to volunteer with us can be really different as well. So people bring real passion for the cause. Many people have a very profound connection to our vision that fewer people die by suicide, either because they have lost somebody to suicide or because they have lived with suicidal feelings themselves. And so that really is motivating for people, and folk want to put their time, energy, skills, they want to make a difference, and they want to meet that need that there is for the service. So it's a really interesting world to operate in when you work alongside so many volunteers. But trust me, volunteers help to make our society go around.
And if I think about it, people who are doing this marvelous but very demanding work, how do they keep up, their own souls, when they're listening to stories that are just desperately difficult most of the time?
Yeah, we have a very high support process in place in Samaritans for our volunteers. So they're always connected with other volunteers when they deliver the service. They debrief at the end of every session that they deliver. So they talk to a leader about the calls that they took, so that they can kind of offload them before going back to their day-to-day lives. It's a very supportive environment between our volunteers. But I think the thing that really keeps people connected to it is that they really see the need for the service. Day in and day out, they are there listening to people share their really innermost thoughts, feelings, concerns, challenges, upsets. And I think one of the things that keeps our volunteers with us and committed is that understanding the need, believing with a real passion in our vision, which is that we're here because we want fewer people to die by suicide. And that sense of really making a difference and contributing, and that sense of connection with other human beings as being part of such an extraordinary service. And I do believe that the Samaritan service is an extraordinary service. I often describe it as it's a really simple, complicated thing, because actually it is really simple, because it's about one human being there to listen to another human being, which is actually really quite simple, but it's really quite profound, because the complexity of what people bring when they contact us is huge. And we are not on a counselling service, and we're not an advice service. We're a listening service. And there is huge power in that simple thing.
And how does the whole subject of listening work in your mind? What does leading the Samaritans taught you about listening, and what might you say to people, I suppose, in more general life about this strange thing called listening? And I was always taught that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you should use them in that proportion.
Well, I think that, listening, I think lots of us think that we're really good at it. And actually, it's much, much harder than most of us think. And I think many of us listen to respond rather than listen to hear. And what I mean by that is, you can see it yourself. You're in a conversation, or you're in a team meeting, and somebody's speaking, and you can see, if you look around the room, you can see the people who are really listening to what's being said. Their body language tells you they're leaning in, they're really quiet. You can really see them concentrating on what that other person is saying. And then you can see someone else who is listening to respond. So they're already formulating in their own head, what's the answer to what that person's saying, or what's my response to what that person's saying going to be? They're preparing their lines already. And in doing that, they're not actually listening. They've switched off the listening bit because they're thinking about the what's my response bit. And that really being able to just stay with the person wherever they're at and give them your full attention is actually much more difficult than most people think, but it's the extraordinary powerful thing. And when I did the Samaritans listening training, I went into that thinking I thought I was a good listener. And I realised, I'm not as good at this as I thought I was actually. And over the course of the training, which goes on for many weeks, I really feel like I understood and learned what does good listening really mean. And I feel like I'm a better person for that now. And I definitely am a better listener. And that's why we often actually try and teach listening skills to everybody and anybody, because, we believe that if all of us could develop our listening skills, and really pay attention to someone else, like you often say to people, don't you? Oh, how are you? And generally you say, yeah, I'm fine. Or yeah, good. Or you almost say yes, good, before even letting them finish asking you how you are. And one of the things we talk about in Samaritans is that ask again. How are you? Yeah, I'm great. Uh-huh. Are you? Are you really? Leave the space. We fill the space so much. We need to leave a bit more space, because actually if it feels like there's space for some of those more difficult thoughts, then we might well welcome those in, and then we can hold them. We can create that safe space where we can hold people's most difficult thoughts of complete hopelessness. And in the just expressing them, it's kind of like untangling a ball of wool. People come to us sometimes with it feeling like a complete ball of knots. And by the end of their call with one of our volunteers, they've still got the same ball, but it's just less knotted. They've been able to do a bit of that unraveling and working it through, and found their own solution, or gotten themselves to a place where they feel like that they can move on with a bit more hope. And that is extraordinary, I think.
And it's often said, if you're not listening, you're not learning. And learning about people at the other end of the telephone, and learning about them by listening seems to me to be pretty important in the Samaritans business. So leaders also need support, which is what you're giving to people by listening to them. What support do leaders need but rarely admit they need in today's world, which I see is extraordinarily pressurized, very, very challenging? And I have to say, in the next 1, 2, or 3 years, it's going to get more telling in that challenging sense. So what support do leaders really need but rarely admit to?
I think there's a lot, but I think two things I would say are I think it is really important for leaders to be able to say and acknowledge that we don't always have the answers. We've gotten things, we get things wrong, or indeed just to say, I'm really stuck. I don't know what to do now, actually. I really don't know where to go from here with this. And I think often the pressure on you as a leader to know the answers. There's an interesting conundrum often in leadership, I think, where folks who are affected by decisions that leaders make want to be engaged and included, and of course that's right, but equally they often want someone to make a decision, someone else to be responsible for making the decision. So that whole piece about accountability, but I think it's really important as a leader for us to sometimes just be able to say, I really don't know, I'm all out of ideas here. And I think that that's quite a hard thing for folk to do, particularly because I think it can make everybody else feel a wobbly. If like, oh, blimey, if they don't know, then what does that mean? So, but I think that is something that we need to admit to more. And I also think that another thing that leaders need, but rarely say we need and very rarely get, is to be told sometimes that we're doing a good job. Most feedback that you get in a leadership role is when things aren't going so well and people want to tell you, what they need to be better. And it's not very often in leadership roles that you get praise, I think. And I think that is, we're only human. We all need sometimes to have someone say, that you did that thing then well done. And I think sometimes people are hesitant about praising somebody they see to be in a sort of position of leadership, either because they think, well, it's not my place to do that, or because, and I think this is very often the case, and someone once said this to me, they think you don't need it. And I'll give you a little example. Last year, when things were very difficult, we were leading through some really difficult transformation conversations in Samaritans. And it was really relentless and really hard and full on, and very difficult. And I had a staffing colleague who I came in one day and just found a little card on my desk. And it was a card that just said, I just wanted you to know that I know that this is really difficult and really hard, and you're trying to lead through some real difficulty, and there's lots of difficult feelings for people. But I just wanted to say, you're doing, I can see you're working really hard and you're doing really well. Thank you. And I said to the person, blimey, thank you so much. I don't get things, that doesn't happen very often. And they said, I said, it means a huge amount to me that you did that. And they said, I think the thing is, none of us think you need it, Julie. And because people assume that if you're in a leadership role that you think you're great all the time, when actually the reality is much of the time in a leadership role, you are worrying constantly about not being good enough and not doing it well enough. So I think that's a couple of things that I think probably leaders need, but don't very often admit to needing.
I know. And it seems to me, as I have wandered around organizations for most of my career, that I see circumstances where people, leaders, don't recognize that just praising somebody is immensely important for them. And in a funny kind of way, it's important for you as the leader as well. And if you can do that in front of other people, you get an immeasurably greater bang for buck. At the other end of the scale, I've also got a client who says to me, Lawrie, what I don't want is constructive criticism. What I want is praise. So it's interesting just to listen to the different perspectives that come. I don't want constructive criticism. What I want is praise. How do you lead then when you know every decision is going to be judged publicly? Because a lot of your work is in the public arena, and historically over the various charities has been in the public arena. How do you lead when you know that everything or lots of the things that you do are going to be judged publicly?
I think it's about, it's for me, it's about getting a balance between understanding that things will become part of the public domain, but not letting that lead you to the wrong decision, if that makes sense. For me, it's about constantly anchoring how I am and what I do with my moral compass. Can I look myself in the face at the end of the day? And that's got to be more important. And for me, how I anchor around that is always prioritizing in decision making what is the right thing and the best thing for the people that need our service. And that doesn't mean I'm always going to get it right. But what is important is that that's what drives and motivates me in my thinking and decision making is the golden thread, the people that need our service. Is it the best thing for them, or is it, what do they need? And as long as I can do that and know that that's what I'm doing, then it makes it easier to tolerate negativity around that in any domain, whether it be within the organisation or in the public domain outside of the organisation. And I think not feeling the need to constantly respond to criticism, particularly in the external domain, because you could waste a lot of time and energy engaging, and particularly in social channels. And it's just, it's relentless, but it's also pointless, because in many of those spaces, people have made a decision about you, and that will never change. But actually, the thing that is important to me isn't necessarily what people think about me. What's important to me is, are we doing the right things in Samaritans for our service users? That is the one thing. But again, it does go back to, you do need some resilience, because it can be exhausting just being criticised.
And you've mentioned moral compass a few times, and I'm with you on that entirely. And I worry these days whether we're in a sort of post-moral compass world in some senses, or whether it's going in that direction. What do you reckon?
I think I have more hope than that. I think there certainly are people that I would question their moral compass, and in global leadership roles, I would say. But I also know from working in the charity sector, particularly, that there are a huge number of people with a very, very strong moral compass that are wanting to do their bit to improve society and improve the wider world. And it can be hard sometimes, particularly at the moment, I think, with the constant narrative around us, and frankly, all of the horror that we're seeing happening around us and around the world. It can be hard to hang on to hope, I think. But I think part of our jobs, particularly in the charity sector, we respond in the charity sector to some of the most distressing, horrific, difficult social issues, domestic violence, food banks, people going hungry, poverty, inequity, disadvantage. So there's a lot of difficult space that we work in the charity sector, but also we are providing solutions. We are looking those challenges and societal issues directly in the eye, and doing what we can to try and improve that across the charity sector. And so I hang on to that for hope.
And a lot of the issues that you've got around you in your role are deeply, deeply sensitive. And at the same time, we've got this need for transparency and kind of telling it as it is. So how does that balance work, do you reckon?
It's a really good question, actually. And I think that transparency can trip people up. I think that sense that I can remember something so clearly from quite early on in my career, years and years and years ago. And there was an organisational restructure being discussed. I wasn't the chief executive of the organisation, but it was in early stages of discussion. And I suddenly heard that a whole team had been told that they might be at risk of redundancy. And we hadn't talked about that team being at risk of redundancy at all in the discussions. And when I spoke to the manager of the team and said, why does all of the team think that? She said, oh, well, because we've been talking about restructure, I felt that I had to, be honest with them, and I had to say to them, well, there is potentially a restructure, and therefore that does mean that you are potentially going to be made redundant. And I said, but what they've taken that, they've heard that, and because they're human, they're now thinking she wouldn't have told us that if actually it wasn't going to happen. And she said, well, I didn't want to be dishonest. And I said, well, the honest boundaried answer would be, we're having to think about the whole organisational structure. We haven't discussed this team personally, directly. There are no decisions that have been made. It's in very early discussions. So I understand that you want certainty, but there literally isn't yet any decisions to share with you. So I want to acknowledge that that feels difficult for you, and I want to commit to you when I'll be able to talk to you some more about that. That's the truth of this. That's the truth. So I think for me, transparency is important, but it's also important to recognise necessary boundaries, both professional and business boundaries. And as a leader, you have to hold information that not everybody can have. And I actually think it's not responsible to think everybody has the same information, because frankly, I get paid more money to hold a huge amount of the complexity and the difficult information. It isn't the case that everybody should have it all of the time. Part of the key of being a good leader is knowing what information do people need when, and also when should we be engaging people more widely in thinking through the solutions to some of these difficult problems. But I've always tried to take an approach of, if there's something that we're discussing but we aren't ready, we can't talk yet about that, it's just acknowledge that. Acknowledge, we're thinking about X, Y. There isn't anything I can share with you about that yet, and I want to recognise that will be difficult, and I want you to know that I'll tell you as soon as we're able to tell you. That will never be enough necessarily for some folk, but it is the most transparent and honest way of dealing with something.
My consulting career has always had charities in its background, in the sense of providing services on a pro bono basis. And I think everyone that I've been involved with, even the ones currently, have difficult financial decisions all the time, and at worst, hand to mouth. So how do you make hard financial decisions when, in your case, the need for this service keeps growing and is likely to want to grow more in the future?
Well, it's a constant struggle. Income generation is getting harder and harder. Not just in the charity sector, it's a struggle everywhere, but it is very difficult currently in the charity sector. Demand for our service is increasing. The Samaritan service is free at the point of contact. Our funding comes almost exclusively from fundraising through the general public, through corporate sponsorship, through legacies, people leaving gifts in their wills, through people making philanthropic donations, through charitable trusts. So every year we have to work really, really hard to raise the 27 million circa that it costs to run the Samaritan service every year. And as you will know, costs are going up that are outside of our control all of the time. And it means that you are faced often with decisions that feel pretty impossible. How do you prioritise where you invest the money when sometimes you can't choose because they're costs that you have no control over? And so it is a constant difficulty and struggle, I think. In the charity sector in the last year, we have seen a lot of charities merging and charities even winding up and exiting because they just couldn't continue financially. So it's extraordinarily hard, is what I would say, and a constant juggle of the limited resources we've got. Where do we put them? where can't we put them, and what do we need to really prioritise? And obviously, in a service like Samaritans, we have to prioritise safety of the service and quality of the service at all times. But it means that sometimes you feel like you are facing impossible decisions. And I think that's just the reality of it. And for me, again, it's about trying to be honest about that with the organisation and with our staff and our volunteers.
When it comes to feedback, Julie, what has most shaped how you lead? We all need feedback. Where do you get your best feedback?
Well, by asking people to give me feedback. I have within the organisation, I ask people, what do you think about this? Did I do that? How did I do that? Did I do that all right? Should I have done that a different way? What do you think? How do you think we should go about this? And that's not just my executive team colleagues, but it's other colleagues in the organisation that I go to for support and advice. I have a really good network of peers in the sector that, frankly, I don't think I could do the job without. People I respect and admire, and who have different skills to me. So, check things out with them, get advice from them, lean on them. And as I mentioned earlier, I've had some great mentors over the years. You were my first Lawrie Chair of Trustees I'd ever had, because at the Suzy Lamplugh Trust. And I learnt a lot from you. I've got a great chair here at Samaritans, who again is a brilliant sounding board. And then I've also had coaches and other mentors over the years who have just kind of given me steers and bits of advice. And one piece of advice that I had some years ago, which in my earlier chief exec life was really helpful to me, was about power, the power of chief executives hold. And, I started out by talking about the fact that, I come from a very working class, very uneducated family background. And the notion that when I was a CEO early on, that had power. There was power. You held power as a CEO. I was extremely uncomfortable about that. I felt very uncomfortable about the notion of thinking I had power and held power. And I kind of wanted to deny it when I was a younger CEO and kind of dismiss it. And a coach and mentor said to me, you do a disservice to everybody by seeking to deny that you have power. Actually, you have to just accept and know and acknowledge that you have it as a chief executive. And then what matters, Julie, is what you do with it. And that has really stayed with me, and it has led me to being really clear that as a CEO, you do hold a lot of power, and that therefore with that comes enormous responsibility. And what you have to do with that responsibility is hold it very carefully and respectfully in the best way that you can. But denying it serves nobody, including yourself.
Well, Julie, we always round off our conversations by asking what a person's pet hate is and your secret passion. And I genuinely don't know what the answer to those two questions are. So what's the truth of those two things in your case?
I think my pet hate is self-interest and self-promotion in leadership. The folks that are in the leadership roles just for their own self-interest. And then I think I don't know if it's a very secret passion. I'm not sure it is a secret, but my passion is our wonderful charity sector. I don't think enough of the public understand how much charities are the glue in our society, providing life-saving services day in and day out. And without the charity sector, our society would literally collapse. I know that to be true. And so I am passionate about our charity sector, have always been, and hazard to guess I will always be.
Great stuff. Julie, it's been a marvellous conversation this morning, and viewers and listeners may well want to say something or ask questions, and they can do that through emailing us at podcast@leadershiplistening.com. But from those viewers and listeners, Julie, we've learnt a lot, and thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Lawrie. Lovely to see you.